Well, hello and welcome to World War II TV. A few technical difficulties there to start off, but we seem to be back and functioning okay. So, before I introduce my guests, could have done a show about Midway at any point in the last year and 2 months I've been doing these shows. It would have fitted perfectly into Battles at Sea Week or Turning Points Week or the Hollywood Myths and Busting Week, but it's taken a while, but we are doing it in History Reanalysed Week. So that's what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about the Battle of Midway, June 1942. So the book that is a game changer. If you remember, some of you watching, I did a book review show a few weeks ago, and I cited, I think, 5 or 6 books of my 1,200 books on my shelves that were, from my point of view, game changers. And this one here, Shattered Sword, was one of those game changers. I read it going, what? No. What? Really? Really? No. For like 3 days. And it changed my view on things. So without further ado, I'll bring my guests in. So joining us live from the USA, John Parshall and Anthony Tully, the authors of Shattered Sword. Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you doing? A bit panicking a few minutes ago, I guess, John. Oh, no, we haven't lost John again, have we?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, dear. The fact, folks, is we've lost John again. Oh, dear. We'll see what happens because it's not in his PC. It seems to be a Comcast problem within the USA. We'll see what's coming, whether he comes back in there. But Tony, you're here, so we'll carry on for a couple minutes. Hope John comes back in. So we might as well talk about something. So in your case, what's your background? How did Midway enter your life?
It's pretty easy as far as what happened is around 10 years old, got interested in naval topics. When I first went to the library, I came across Walter Lord's book, Day of Infamy, on Pearl Harbor, because I was interested in Pearl Harbor because saw some pictures right after we saw Tor in 1971, the family, I mean. Because I read Walter Lord's Day of Infamy, I then got interested in Walter Lord's writings, and right there was Night to Remember on the Titanic, and the other one was Incredible Victory on the Battle of Midway. So reading those one after another, long story short, you can see got right into the Battle of Midway around 4th and 5th grade, and that one thing led to another, and buying Ballantine books on the war history and especially Pacific War, because Midway, the Incredible Victory book, was so fascinating. And about the operations and what all had unfolded, it got me more interested in the Pacific War than on the Atlantic side, though interest would existed on both sides. So that's how the main interest began, and it went full blast from there through junior high and all the way onward.
And how did you meet John? I know you have your combined ops combined fleet website, but how did you get together and decide you were going to do this book?
The website is exactly the key, because what happened is when first came online with Windows 1995, that old operating system, when it was just coming online, the first thing I did on an internet search is went to a few interesting topics like volcanoes and like, here's one they won't have. They'll have something on Imperial Japanese Navy. And I was wrong. His site comes right up. It's only a few pages long, but it had an article on an obscure sinking of the USS Eversole. So I knew right away it was even a substantive site, even though it's kind of small at the moment. Also, he mentions the Japanese battleship Mutsu, its accidental sinking, which that was completely unheard of at that time in 1996. You couldn't find a thing on it. And here he is talking about visiting some of the wreckage in Japan and all that. So it's fascinating. I immediately wrote him an email, and that's how we got a correspondence going. Not long after, I suggest, because the late Al Nevitt, who did the destroyer tracking records, or TROMs, I make a suggestion to do one for Japanese carriers. And that's how our site correspondence begins. It's in full swing from 1998 forward.
And, I do hope John comes back. If not, we may have to delay a bit or postpone, because we can't do it without.
Yeah, I can always redo a different time.
We'll see how it goes, but we'll just carry on talking and hope things recover. It's just the perils of live show. But one of the things I was going to say is that as a Brit, probably the biggest battle that we talk about that has entered into the public consciousness is the Battle of Britain. And I think there's a parallel with the USA's view of the Battle of Midway. Okay, it's later in the war, but it's about the same length of time in your war as the Battle of Britain was in our war, given that we started a bit early. It's, several months in. And the Battle of Britain, the point I often make, indeed on this channel, is the Battle of Britain has become this mythologized, romanticized version of our history. This Britain all alone against a dominating Luftwaffe. We're the underdogs. We are standing, defending our shores. Churchill symbology, the lone Spitfire flying over, and we now know the Battle of Britain perhaps wasn't quite as close a run as we think it was, and that the Observer Corps were doing a great job. Our radar was working. Our RAF tactics to intercept were actually pretty good. The Luftwaffe weren't quite as sorted out as we think they were. But in fact, although authors kind of make this point, the public still wants to have this idea that the Battle of Britain is this sort of standalone victory. So do you think that's a valid interpretation of how Midway is perceived by Americans, that there's a feel that it needs to be this up against the odds battle?
I would definitely agree with that perception. In fact, and still in some ways it's still true. It's certainly parallel to the Battle of Britain in the sense that it's a perceived point where everything got turned around and there's hope again. It's definitely that in the conventional understanding, as well as and even the actual tide of battle, because it's the Battle of Midway that allows the United States to start doing offensive operations like the invasion of Guadalcanal in August. I mean, any kind of setback at Midway or the Battle of Coral Sea right before will change the ability to invade Guadalcanal in August. So it is a turning point, and just as the Battle of Britain was in that sense. There is also a similarity to the degree that there is a little bit of there's a little bit of mythology built into it. It's not that misleading though. It's just, but it kind of overstates the case as far as the odds are better than they looked, even though they're pretty risky, but mainly because the Japanese end up making the odds more reasonable than they needed to be. They come into battle in such a way where the point of contact between the two forces is almost even in aircraft terms. In fact, there's even a slight American advantage when you count the full land-based air. So, but that doesn't make the battle any less remarkable or extraordinary for the way it unfolded, and especially the moment where they get the three carriers simultaneously in the same time frame around 10:20.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I was thinking about it this morning when I was going out myself, that there are many claims for the most significant turning point, even of 1942 and 43. There's Stalingrad, there's El Alamein, there's this. But in terms of the swiftness of the conclusion of a battle, Midway is hard to beat in that regard. It breaks down to really just hours, whereas Stalingrad is weeks, if not months. El Alamein is days, if not weeks. This all takes shape in a matter of minutes almost, isn't it? So in that regard, there aren't really a more important few hours in the Pacific, or indeed in the entire world that affected the events that preceded it and followed it than those couple of hours around 10:30 on the morning of June the 4th, 1942. Now, we still haven't got John back yet. We'll carry on talking a little bit, and if we can't get John back,
he's trying to reboot a router.
Yeah, well, he's rebooting, so hopefully he'll be back in there. Because John is going to, when we get John back, whether it's now or whether it's sometime later, John's going to start with kind of a 20-minute, 25-minute kind of run through the battle. Then we're going to discuss it, but we're just kind of filling in. It doesn't mean that you're not important, Tony. It's a double act, and I can't have my double act with just one of you. But this where it sits in the historiography, I think, is very interesting. We'll talk about that later as well, and the analysis of it has changed over the decades, and it'll probably change again. Now, again, while we're waiting for John, you've been more involved in recent years with kind of archaeological work there, so the diving and things like that. So as that doesn't really affect what we're talking about in the show, just tell us a little bit about what you're learning from that, because it's not changing the nature of the battle. It's just kind of refining your knowledge of exactly what happened on the Japanese carriers when they went down. So how exciting is that kind of work to get involved in?
Oh, it's been extraordinarily exciting, especially to be able to compare in some cases, reports of eyewitnesses of damage reports. It looks like he may be back.
It looks like he's back again.
I need to pour myself a stiff drink, even though it's a Monday afternoon. But yeah,
I've got a 15-year-old Glenfiddich in the back there. Is that? Can I pass you one?
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah. Good. We were just talking. So well, you're back, John. We were just talking about a little bit of the reputation of Midway. I was just asking Tony to explain a little bit about the kind of the diving work he's been done in. So we'll just kind of finish that off for a couple of minutes, then come back to you. I don't want to feel that we're neglecting Tony now, but just so how did this come about? This be able to visit the site now, and what have you been learning?
Well, the wreck expedition, they began back in 2017 when the Paul Allen group found the Indianapolis, and I was mainly involved in the Surigao Strait explorations, and we were able to consult in several wrecks that followed, like the USS Lexington, USS Juneau, and Midway was at the tail end of it, is what you're asking about. It's the Paul Allen group explanations of it, of the Kaga. What it told us, it tended to confirm the eyewitness accounts we had achieved from one of the Japanese survivors, Haru Yoshina, who was on the Kaga and had even done a little sketch of how she looked like right before she went down at the sunset on the fort. What was found of the wreck tended to confirm, kind of described, even down to the fact that apparently it went down an even keel, that kind of thing. It doesn't change our understanding of the battle so much as it confirms some of the visual implications we had from some of the survivors' reports. And it did, and the Kage and Kaga did turn out to be far apart, just like the Japanese maps show. I mean that, but other than that, it didn't, it didn't change our understanding of the battle.
It's refinement, isn't it? I say that about the digitalization of archives and the addition of aerial photos. It doesn't necessarily change things. It just allows you to kind of build a more complete picture and present information in a more almost three-dimensional way as we have that information. So, well, John, you're back now. Thanks for telling us about that, Tony. Sorry?
Sometimes it does give you a big revelation, just in the case of the Midway carriers, but like Surigao, showed a lot of
it just hasn't happened yet. Maybe there is still that breakthrough to come. But John, we have you back there. Tony has told us a little bit about how you two met via the website and what have you. But as I said, a minute ago, we're going to start. Well, we're going to start again with you giving this kind of run through about the battle. And then we'll kind of pull it apart and examine it. So theoretically, you're back with us. Fingers crossed.
Yes.
I'm feeling kind of like I'm in some kind of ops room somewhere where I'm waiting for information to come in, and it's all, you just got to sweat it out, like they say in the movies. So I feel I'm in that moment there, and just hope that everything goes right. But you're going to get your PowerPoint ready, and John's going to kind of run us through things. And folks, if you have questions later on, we'll kind of bring them in, and we'll do this initial kind of run through, and then we'll just kind of spitball really and talk about Midway and the legends and the myths and how they built up and how they are wrong, and we'll go from there. So John is just trying to get things ready. So
working on that.
And so there we go. So we have a presentation. So I'll hand over to you then, John.
Excellent. All right. So what I want to roll through today for the next 25, 30 minutes is giving a little better sense of context around the battle. And then in the course of actually looking at the battle and what happened during the battle, I want to talk about one of the big sort of pre-2005 myths that Shattered Sword wanted to address. And in the course of that, I'm actually going to take us down into the weeds a little bit and look at some of the primary source material. And I think that people that are, interested in history and where history comes from will find that kind of interesting, I hope. And then wrap up with just a few minutes talking a little bit more about why was Midway as important as it was. So just a little bit of context, where we find ourselves in the middle of 1942. I think Americans just in general tend to sort of overfocus on Pearl Harbor as being the beginning of the Pacific War. But the reality is that Pearl Harbor was just one component in a much larger, broader plan of campaign for the Japanese. The basic impetus for the Japanese was to attack towards the south, for the very simple reason that it's down in places like Borneo and Malaya and Sumatra that you find the oil, the rubber, the tin, the manganese, and the other strategic materials that are necessary for the Japanese to keep their war machine in operation. And so it's towards that direction that they want to go. And the last thing that they want to have happen in the middle of their operations that are aimed south is a counterattack across the breadth of the Central Pacific being mounted from the American base at Pearl Harbor. And so that is why Pearl Harbor gets attacked. It's to, take the American fleet sort of out of the mix while the Japanese are busy with their dirty business down to the south. So what you see developing very quickly over the first month or so of the war are attacks aimed at Wake and Guam. Hong Kong is attacked very shortly. Actually, the Japanese land troops in Malaya even a couple hours before Pearl Harbor is attacked. And then just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse are sunk in the South China Sea. Troops are also landed on Luzon and Mindanao. And so you can see the sort of broad offensive unfolding across the breadth of the Western Pacific. Those first phase operations go so well for the Japanese that they decide to speed up their operational timetable. And so what ends up happening in relatively short order, starting in about February, Singapore falls on February 15th, of course, one of the most calamitous defeats in British military history. Manila has fallen a little bit earlier. MacArthur's been pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula. And then you see a series of naval battles around Java developing, which results in the extermination of Allied naval power in that region, followed very quickly by landings on Java itself. Just to sort of cap things off, there are carrier raids against Darwin, Australia. The port of Rabaul is taken at the tip of New Britain, which is going to be sort of the linchpin of Japan's defensive and offensive efforts in and around New Guinea and Australia. And then the final blow is struck in the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean when the Japanese send a carrier task force into that neck of the woods and just raise holy hell there for about a week or so, sink a British aircraft carrier and a couple of cruisers and a fairly large amount of merchant shipping as well. So by the time you get to about March of 1942, March, April, the Japanese have secured for themselves one of the largest empires in the history of man. And the question for them is, sort of what is going to be next. And I won't bore you with all the details around that. The bottom line is that they decide to launch a attack into the Central Pacific aimed at the island of Midway to lure the American carriers out to battle and destroy them. In between then, the first carrier battle in history is fought at Coral Sea, which is a check to Japanese ambitions, but is not exactly viewed as either a victory or a defeat, I think, by either side at that particular point in time. So just to sort of put this in a larger context of what's going on around the globe, when we get to, mid-May of 1942, Malta is being busily bombed into rubble by the Germans. Rommel is about to drop the hammer at Gazala and run around the end of the Gazala line. And meanwhile, Operation Drumbeat is turning the East Coast and the Caribbean into a shooting gallery for Allied tankers. And so it's important to sort of get our heads around the fact that this is a very bleak, dark time for the Allies. Things are just going wrong everywhere. And, we've somehow got to turn around these respective train wrecks. Around this time, the Americans have previously broken Japan's operational naval code, JN-25B, and we are reading enough of that message traffic to begin getting wind around May 15th or so that the Japanese are planning an operation aimed at the island of Midway. And that gives Admiral Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, bare time to scrape together the assets that he needs and send them off to the environs of Midway to await battle there. So that brings us to the actual battle itself. And we're going to start things off at 0430 on 4 June. And this is the general configuration of things. The Japanese carrier force, Kido Butai, is coming in from the northwest at a distance of about 250 miles from the island of Midway. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, there are now 2 American carrier task forces off to their northeast that are lurking and hoping to ambush any Japanese force that shows up. So that brings us to the point of the presentation where, you know, all good authors have to do a reading from their book. And so without further ado, what I'd like to talk about here is a passage from Shattered Sword. And Tony and I write, that is to say, they become wrapped in a set of popular beliefs, the common wisdom that interprets the battle and its meanings. In many cases, this mythology centers on a pivotal event, some noteworthy occurrence that captures the imagination, thereby crystallizing what the battle was all about. History is replete with such defining moments: the breaking of the French Imperial Guard at Waterloo, Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, the siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. They are timeless events and not to be reinterpreted lightly. Yet it is imperative that such momentous happenings be understood properly, for if these are the lenses through which we perceive great battles, then it stands to reason that any flaws in these crystals must necessarily distort our perception of the battle as a whole. And so that brings me then to one of the central myths at Midway. And if you had to pick one myth, and I'll just say it as an aside, this myth is courtesy of this gentleman here, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. But the biggest myth in the battle, I think, is around the status of the flight decks at 10:20 in the morning when that climactic dive bomber attack from the Americans comes in. So that's the myth that we're going to explore here in the next little bit. One thing to keep in mind before we go into this is understanding how carriers in World War II conducted flight operations. And this is in the day and age before there are angled flight decks on your aircraft carrier, which means that you can really be doing only one thing at a time. You can be spotting aircraft on that flight deck, you know, bringing them up from the hangars and putting them on the flight deck, getting them ready for launch. You can be launching those aircraft, or you can be recovering those aircraft. And both spotting and recovery basically shut down the flight deck completely for a certain amount of time while you're getting those aircraft ready to go. So now I want to talk a little bit about the first phase of the battle. And the mechanism I want to use to explore this battle is actually Mitsuo Fuchida's book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, because it's an extremely important account, and it formed the basis for what I would call the Japanese side of the battle for the better part of 60 years or so. So let's hear what Fuchida has to say about the morning launch against the island of Midway starting at 0430. That attack has just gone up, and Fuchida now writes, "The flight deck, which moments before had been filled with a deafening din, was now silent. There were no planes, no drone of engines. But the stillness was again broken by the raucous loudspeaker as it blared out the order, 'Prepare second attack wave.' To the accompaniment of clanging bells, planes soon were being whisked up to the flight deck and rolled from the elevators to their line-up positions. The forward elevators brought up fighters, the midship and stern elevators delivered bombers. Maintenance crews wheeled torpedoes from the ammunition rooms and secured them to the planes. All hands worked feverishly." In other words, what Fuchida is telling us here is that there is a reserve strike force of aircraft that are being held back in case there are any American naval forces nearby. And those strike planes are now up on the flight deck and ready to go in case Admiral Nagumo needs to use them against any American naval forces. As soon as that happens, well, not as soon as, about an hour and a half later, Midway gets bombed at 0620 by the strike that was launched at 0430. And here's some artwork that generally depicts that particular attack. The American fighters that are over the island basically get completely backhanded and are ineffectual largely. And then Midway itself is fairly heavily bombed as a result. The strike leader from that morning strike, a guy named Tominaga, radios back at 0700 to Admiral Nagumo and says, "We need a second strike. I have not put Midway out of business." And at the same time that this is all happening, Admiral Nagumo's fleet is actually beginning to be attacked by some of the aircraft that were based on Midway itself. Those attacks are ineffectual. There's no damage to the Japanese ships, and the Americans suffer very heavy losses. But Nagumo, as you can imagine, is concerned that he's been sighted and that Midway is attacking him. All this time, there have been Japanese scout planes that have been out around the western or the eastern flank of the fleet, making sure that there are no American ships out there. And thus far, up to 7:15, they haven't found anything. And so, in light of the fact that Tominaga has told him that we need a second strike against Midway and that there are no American ships out here, Nagumo decides to order that reserve group of aircraft to be rearmed with land attack weapons. So let's hear what Fuchida has to say about that. Consequently, at 07:15, just as the American torpedo attack is winding down, Nagumo ordered the planes of the second wave, which had been armed for an attack on enemy ships, to prepare instead for another strike on Midway. This meant that the torpedo-laden level bombers on Akagi and Kaga had to be de-armed and reloaded with bombs. The ones already on the flight deck were taken down to the hangar one after another, and the rearming began. Flying crews and maintenance men worked furiously at the arduous task. So Fuchida has told us at this point that the reserve strike came up, was sitting on the flight deck for a couple hours, and then now they are being moved below to the hangar decks to be rearmed again. So here's a picture of some of the Midway-based American aircraft coming out to attack Nagumo. This is the first combat usage of the TBF Avenger. 6 planes in, 5 planes shot down. Only 1 plane makes it home with 2 live aviators. The Americans are finding out very quickly that the Japanese Zeros of their combat air patrol really know their business. So now that we've got the planes rearming, that sort of takes us to the second phase of the battle. About a half an hour after Nagumo makes that decision, lo and behold, from his number 4 scout plane comes in a sighting report of American surface ships. And as soon as that comes in, Nagumo immediately countermands his rearming order and begins switching those aircraft back to anti-ship ordnance once again. There's now a second series of attacks by American planes, particularly B-17s that are coming in and are going to be loitering overhead for the more than half an hour. No damage again being done to the Japanese. Some of the dive bomber formations that attack are very heavily attrited by the Japanese. And all this time, Nagumo is wrestling with a fundamental question. He knows that he's got strike aircraft coming back from Midway that are going to need to land. They're going to have wounded crewmen. They're going to be running low on gas. So I got to bring those planes down at some point. But I also want to counterstrike against the Americans if possible. I've got dive bombers that I could potentially attack with pretty much now. Do I want to do that or not? In the end, Nagumo opts for what is the doctrinally correct decision, which is to hold his hand. He's going to land his morning attack force first, and then he will rearm his torpedo planes from the reserve strike, send them off with the dive bombers so that he'll have a complete strike package of both high altitude and low altitude attack assets. But let's hear what Fuchida says about that decision to not launch before recovering that morning strike. By Nagumo's decision, taken shortly after 0830, to recover the Midway strike before doing anything else, Admiral Nagumo virtually committed himself to the second, more cautious plan of action. On board Akagi, when the order was given to clear the deck for recovery, the weary maintenance crews began once more to lower the torpedo bombers to the hangar deck. There, the orders now were to switch back from bombs to torpedoes. In other words, what Fuchida is telling us is not only did we rearm the reserve attack wave, we actually got them back up on the flight deck before this decision on Nagumo's part comes down to us. So the picture that he's painted for us is reserve strike force up, reserve strike force down, reserve strike force back up, and now for the second time, they are going down again. So here's a picture from one of those B-17s. We're going to be coming back to some of these photographs here in just a little bit. That brings us to the third phase of the battle. So Nagumo, having made this decision to recover his morning strike force before he counterattacks against the Americans, does exactly that. Those B-17s, peel off at around 08:35 or so, and almost immediately thereafter, the Japanese begin landing airplanes. Shortly after that landing is accomplished, though, immediately a third series of American attacks start coming in, and this time these are attacks by carrier torpedo planes. These are the first of the aircraft that have been launched by the American carrier task forces off to the northeast. And again, very heavy casualties on the part of the Americans, and no damage being committed to the Japanese. So here's a painting of the most famous of these attacks is Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. 15 planes in, 15 planes shot down, only one guy left alive in the water. Her sister squadron, Torpedo 6, is handled similarly roughly about 20 minutes later. And thus far, you have to say that the combat air patrol for the Japanese is doing exemplary work. What the Japanese don't know is that by about 10 o'clock in the morning, their formation has been sighted by two separate groups of American dive bombers that are coming in from two separate angles. And that is going to set us up for this 1020 dive bomber attack in just about 20 minutes. So schematically, what we're looking at is something like this. With Yorktown's aircraft, a squadron of torpedo planes, and then a squadron of dive bombers coming in roughly from the southeast. And the dive bombers kind of looping around to the north, and they're going to go after Soryu. And then approaching from the southwest, you've got two squadrons of dive bombers from Enterprise, scouting 6 and bombing 6, which are going to be going after Kaga and Akagi. And what ends up happening here is, since Torpedo Squadron 3 is the most visible of these formations, Japan's combat air patrol end up going after those torpedo planes and do not see the dive bombers coming in from these various directions. And you can imagine what's about to come. So now I want to talk a little bit about the 1020 attack and looking at it through the primary sources that we have to hand. And one of the first things that I want to show you is a schematic of the air operations on board all 4 of the Japanese carriers during the morning. And this is a very complex illustration, and there will not be a quiz. But the important thing to focus on here is all the little yellow triangles. Every time you see one of those little yellow triangles, that means that there is a group of combat air patrol fighters that is being landed on board one of those carriers. And you'll recall that when we are landing groups of aircraft, there can't be anything on the fantail of these carriers, right? So I can't have been doing any sort of spotting operations on these carriers when those yellow triangles are coming down. And the impression that I want to create here is these flight decks are really busy places, and that makes a great deal of sense because the Americans have been attacking the Japanese with, penny packet squadrons of aircraft basically since 0700 in the morning. So, the Japanese, not surprisingly, are cycling a lot of cap fighters up and down during this time period. Second thing I want to show you is some of those B17 pictures. So here's a picture of the carrier Soryu carving a giant donut in the ocean as she's avoiding bombs. You can see on her flight deck one plane at the very fantail. That's a scouting aircraft that's going to be launched relatively shortly. Here's her sister ship, Hiryu. You see 3 zeros on her flight deck, roughly a midship. This particular cap watch is going to be launched fairly shortly after 0830. So once again, not a lot of aircraft on the flight deck. And here is Akagi in the rough same time period. Not a single plane on her flight deck at all. So that's interesting. And I think you have to say as sort of an intermediate conclusion that Fuchida's rendition of there being reserve strike force aircraft up on those flight decks doesn't seem to jibe with what we're seeing in either the operational records or the photographic records. And Tony and I very much believe that those reserve planes were never on the flight deck at all. It doesn't make any sense for them to be there. You would hold them in the hangars until such time as you need them. So that then brings us to Fuchida's description of the 1020 dive bomber attack itself, which is one of the most famous passages in his entire book. He entitles it 5 Fateful Minutes. Fuchida writes, preparations for a counterstrike against the enemy had continued on board our 4 carriers throughout the enemy torpedo attacks. One after another, planes were hoisted from the hangar and quickly arranged on the flight deck. There was no time to lose. At 10:20, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch when ready. On Akagi's flight deck, all planes were in position with engines warming up. The big ship began turning into the wind. Within 5 minutes, all her planes would be launched. 5 minutes. Who would have dreamed that the tide of battle would shift completely in that time period? At 10:24, the order to start launching came from the bridge by voice tube. The air officer flapped a white flag, and the first Zero fighter gathered speed and whizzed off the deck. At that instant, a lookout screamed, "Hell divers!" I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting toward our ship. So that's good stuff, very dramatic, and if we're to believe Fuchida, the strike planes are absolutely chock-a-block on all 4 of these carriers and are ready to go. And then at the last minute, here come the American dive bombers. Turns out there's some problems with that. When we talk about the mechanics of what it takes to actually mount one of these operations, to get those planes out of the flight deck, up on the flight deck, warm up their engines, arm them in the case of the dive bombers, yada, yada, yada. The bottom line is that you're talking about a bare minimum of about 30 minutes to haul all of these planes out of the hangar and get them up on the flight deck and do all that stuff. And probably 40 to 45 minutes was more normal when we're conducting flight operations. So there's a certain window of time here where I absolutely have to have that flight deck clear on the fantail in order to be doing this stuff. So now we're going to get to what I call fun with Koda Choshos. And you may ask, what the heck is a Koda Chosho? Koda Choshos are the air group records from each of these carriers, and they were written down by the assistant air officer on the islands of all of these ships while they were conducting flight ops. And they give us a tremendous amount of detail regarding what's actually going on that carrier. They tell us the names of all of the people in those airplanes, what ordnance they were carrying, what the weather conditions were like, when they went up, when they went down, the whole bit. So here is a Koda Chosho, and hopefully this won't make your eyes bleed, but let me walk you through this. Up in the upper left in the yellow, you see some kanji for Akagi. In the pink box next to that, you see 1765, which means Showa era 17. Month 6, day 5. This ship is operating on Tokyo time, so even though we're across the international date line here, as far as Akagi is concerned, this is June 5th. Down the little orange box next to that, you see 1819. That says 18 dive bombers, a scout plane, and 9 zeros. The light blue stuff is giving us the ordnance that's being carried by these planes. So you can see 25 or type 25 bombs are being carried by these 18 aircraft, and they've also got 20 millimeter and 7.7 millimeter ammunition. And then crucially over here in the purple box, the first entry you see is for 0128. Again, we're operating on Tokyo time. So this is actually 428 local. This is Akagi's flight record showing her launching her morning strike against Midway. And so you can see when those planes go up, when they go down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we go a little further in her Koda Choshos, what we start to see is all of her combat air patrols. So if you look over on the left side, you see the little yellow box there that says Ichiban. That's my #1 combat air patrol. And there are orange boxes next to it, which have the names of all of the guys in those 3 combat air patrol zeros. You'll notice that they too went up with the strike force at 0128, as shown by that little pink box there. And then the blue boxes show us all the ammunition that they carried and what they expended. Down a little bit towards the bottom in the purple boxes, you can see entries for 0710. Those are planes being landed at 10:10 in the morning on Akagi's flight deck. And you'll see that those are combat air patrol fighters that are coming down at 10:10. And the names of those guys are Tanaka, Ohara, and Iwashiro. So this is what the Kodos are telling us in terms of what's going on in flight operations. So bear in mind, Akagi gets bombed at 10:27 in the morning, but she landed aircraft at 10:10, 17 minutes, right? There is absolutely no way that the strike planes could have been brought up on the deck and been warmed up and ready to go within 17 minutes. Furthermore, if we look a little further in Akagi's Kodo Chosho, we find this entry for her combat watch number 9, which goes up in the air at 0725, which is 10:25 local. Remember, Fuchida tells us about that lead 0 whizzing off the end of the flight deck. Well, yeah, there was a 0 whizzing off the end of the flight deck, and it was this dude right here, Petty Officer First Class Kimura Koryo. But he was not a strike escort. He was a combat air patrol fighter. So you can see that Fuchida is sort of mishmashing some of the combat air patrol operations with this mythical strike operation that was supposed to be going up at that time. The bottom line is that Fuchida's account is complete nonsense. At the time of the 1020 dive bomber attack, there were no strike aircraft on the flight deck whatsoever. Really what's going on here is Fuchida is trying to shift blame away from the First Air Fleet's officers and basically saying, hey, you know, we didn't lose the battle because we messed up. We lost the battle because it was bad luck, right? And so the bottom line is, too, that the Japanese have actually known about these flaws in Fuchida's account since the 1970s, but it wasn't until Tony and I and some of our compatriots began taking a hard look at the Kodo Choshos in the course of the writing of this book that we sort of started getting wind of some of this stuff. So we here in the West are really still playing catch-up. Anyway, that concludes our dive into the primary sources, and now we'll do a quick walk through the rest of the battle. In comes the American dive bomber attack from 1022 to 1027. The result of that attack is that Soryu, Kaga, and Akagi are all put out of action, mortally wounded. They're going to sink either later today or early tomorrow morning. What ends up happening then for the remainder of the afternoon, carrier Yorktown is hit around lunchtime by Hiryu's first counterattack with her dive bombers. She's temporarily knocked out of action, but American damage control is good, and she's back up and steaming within relatively short order, only to be hit again at around 2:20 by Hiryu's second counterattack of torpedo planes, which hit Yorktown twice and leave her in a listing condition, whereupon she is abandoned. Unfortunately for Hiryu, she lurks in the neighborhood rather too long and is sighted by the remaining aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet. She's attacked around supper time, mortally wounded with 4 bomb hits. And so by about 1700 or so in the afternoon, all 4 Japanese carriers are out of action. And that is pretty much all she wrote in terms of the battle. The final results then are 4 Japanese carriers sunk. Yorktown is sunk a couple days later by a submarine, but you know it's a 4-to-1 outcome as far as the Americans are concerned. So this is a very stunning victory and a real turnaround in our fortunes. In terms of the importance of the battle, you can measure that again in just flight decks. If you take a look at the situation in the Pacific at the beginning of the Pacific War, the Japanese had big 6 big flight decks and about 5 smaller light fleet carriers that they're operating. The Americans have only got 4 fleet carriers in the Pacific at this time. If you fast forward to right before the Battle of Midway, the situation looks like this. Lexington was sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. Saratoga's in the shop because she keeps running into submarines that torpedo her. Shokaku and Zuikaku on the Japanese side are likewise in the shop from Coral Sea, and Shoho was sunk at Coral Sea. Now, if we walk out after Midway, ouch. You know, we lose 1 carrier, the Japanese lose 4. What's happened here is the Americans have clawed their way back to rough parity in carrier forces in the Pacific. And again, in the dark days of 1942, you know, being able to claw back to parity was a huge accomplishment for us. And what that does is it puts in mind of this gentleman, Admiral Ernest King, who is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy. King is a very aggressive individual, and he sees an opportunity here to get out of this defensive stance that we've been in for the first 5 months of this conflict and actually now counterattack and try to seize the initiative away from Japan. And the result of that is going to be, in very short order, 2 different land campaigns unfolding in the South Pacific. The first is going to be at Guadalcanal, where the Americans counterattack in early August. And that is going to kick off a series of naval battles in and around Guadalcanal for about the next 6 months. And during all this time, too, there's going to be a constant drumbeat of air attacks coming down from Rabaul to try to knock out Henderson Field. There's going to be a number of very fierce ground battles as well. So this is exactly the kind of high-tempo, attritionally based warfare that the Americans need in order to start bringing their weight to bear on the Japanese. This is really, you know, exactly what the doctor ordered as far as the Americans are concerned. And meanwhile, in New Guinea, the Japanese have launched a land campaign across the Owen Stanley Mountains, intending to take Port Moresby, which is checked just short of Port Moresby and then driven back. That's going to be dragging first the Australians in, but then eventually a couple of American divisions as well. And so there's going to be combat here in New Guinea for the next 6 months until Bunagona are taken. And frankly, there's going to be combat in the areas you see just to the north of there around Finchhaven, Ley, and Salamoa for the remainder of 1943. So what's happening now is sort of twin offensives against the Japanese, who from their perspective, sitting in Rabaul, look at Guadalcanal and New Guinea as sort of this twin-headed monster that are just tearing them apart, and they cannot handle the attrition from either of those campaigns. So really, in terms of Midway's importance, I would say that it's the single most important battle of the Pacific War, but not because it was decisive in an absolute sense, but because of what it does in terms of creating a new context in the Pacific War. It allows the Allies to create the kind of conflict that they needed. It's the gift that keeps on giving, if you will, and allows these truly decisive campaigns in the south of the Pacific to be set up and running a lot earlier than they would have otherwise. So that ends my prepared remarks, and now let's get back to the Q&A. I'm not able to hear you, Paul. You're muted.
Yeah, that was my fault there. I muted myself because I was enjoying it. So firstly, thank you very much. That was just brilliant. So I've been making notes while you've been talking, and people have been watching as well. So first thing, and please jump in as well, Tony, we want your feedback as well. You just said there, John, about this setting into motion this next phase and the Solomon Islands and Santa Cruz, and why, therefore, is that kind of left out in the way that Midway is discussed now? Midway is as far as some people are concerned, it just goes Pearl Harbor, Midway, end of the war. Why do we not talk about those next chapters? I mean, particularly, you know, I'm not going to reference the film as more than a little bit, but I will mention the film. The latest film, the 2019 film, did make big effort to put in Pearl Harbor and the Marshall Islands and Coral Sea and Doolittle raid, but it still ended on June the 4th, didn't it? I think it didn't even go into the next day. It didn't go the next day, did it?
No, they didn't go to Mikuman.
So why are they not doing that next chapter? Is it just brevity, time? What's your feeling about that? That's my first question for both of you or either of you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that part of what's happening there is that, we've got this climatic battle that happens in the Central Pacific, and then all of a sudden the theater of operations gets yoinked about 2,000 miles south, into this completely different area. And it becomes very complex very quickly. I do think that the Americans tend to over-focus on Guadalcanal, and that's a campaign that gets a lot of, verbiage here in the U.S., and we tend to ignore what's going on in New Guinea to a great extent, whereas the Australians have the exact opposite. For them, Kokoda is the defining campaign of their war, and they sort of ignore what's going on. Well, Coral Sea too, and they sort of ignore what's going on in Guadalcanal. Again, I think it's the Japanese that have the correct perspective on this thing. They're facing both of these things, and they just can't cope with it.
Okay, Tony, have you got a comment about that, or you good, Tony?
Well, one of the things is, like if you take the recent movie, they did show the Hiryu scuttling, so they kind of let it stand for the other three sinking. I could tell that's kind of cinematic license. It was a decent way to end it. They didn't follow up with the air attacks after, but that's not, a movie doesn't have that much time. Now, in books, for them to go on and describe Guadalcanal, they'd have to spend some time on setup. The real interesting one is the one John mentioned, is how little New Guinea is mentioned. The Japanese even try a major counteroffensive in July at New Guinea that's hardly known and is beaten back at Milne Bay. That's the real neglected one before Guadalcanal. But Guadalcanal does rate all its attention. It's very important. It's the one that puts the Japanese Navy, not till 1944, Philippine Sea, if I don't know about, do they really get to come back to try a major fleet battle like Midway again?
I mean, folks, we've got quite a few new viewers tonight, which is great. This is proving to be a very popular show, so fantastic. And for those who are new to us, go back and check the shows from a couple of weeks ago. Dr. Carl James from Australia talked about the Kokoda Trail, depending on which way you want to talk about it, and he talked about Milne Bay, and of course, John McManus talked about the Battle of Buna. But bringing it back to Midway, Fuchida. So he's clearly central to your book. He's central to your re-examination of this. And I'm coming back to this point you made about him deflecting blame away from himself, and that's his motivation. I completely get that, except my next question is, why write the book at all? I mean, he could have just said nothing at all. Would he have? Did he need? You only need to put the blame somewhere else if you are accused of something. So when he wrote that book, is it 52 he wrote the book, if I'm correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in 1951.
Or just trying to make money?
51. You're right, Tony. Yeah.
I think I personally think he was told to.
Okay.
Oh, that's an interesting notion. Yeah, I think
just opinion. It's a feeling.
It could well be. And there's another book that comes out exactly the same time from Admiral Kusaka, who is the chief of staff of Admiral Nagumo. The bottom line is, if you go home after a battle where you've lost 4 aircraft carriers, there's going to be some splaining that has
fair enough. Yeah.
What exactly happened, gentlemen? And Fuchida, I'm quite sure, had no idea that the Kokoda Choshos had survived the war. And I sort of look at him as kind of the front man of this informal cabal of First Air Fleet officers that are trying to deflect blame. And Fuchida thinks, if I get out there first with my account, first mover advantage, I put my stake in the ground, and that's I'm going to write the history books, to paraphrase Winston Churchill. And frankly, if he thinks that the air group records on the carriers have been destroyed, who's going to call him on it? So,
and how did they survive? Several people asked when you were talking how those logs survived.
Well, I'll give you one specific. In Kaga's case, the ready room is under the stern. It's not in the bridge, so it's not destroyed when the bridge is. The fantail ready room survives till the ship is sunk. So that's one example. Kagi's transfer is fairly orderly, so it's not surprising. They just had to leave the big staff forwards up in the island.
Yeah, okay. and I'll mention too that the log books for all of these carriers also made it off of the ships. We know that because they were burned in Tokyo at the end of the war. So it's actually not that surprising. The Kodos were in many cases used for promotional purposes. It's kind of an informal record of, all of these individuals. And so they wanted to preserve those, for things like, okay, this guy needs to be promoted. So they were fairly...
John, weren't they even among the pilots where they were like air group records among themselves as much as for the official record, right? Is what you're saying?
That could be. Jim Saruk is the real expert on these records. And that's actually sort of an interesting part of the research on this whole book, is that Jim Saruk just has thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of Kodo Chosho sitting in his basement, because Jim's thing is he likes to be able to trace individual guys as they move from unit to unit to unit to unit. And so,
wow.
God help us if his house ever catches on fire, because it's, the central trove of Kodo Chosho.
I'm going to bring a question from one of our viewers, and I've got some more for you. So Trent Tolenko, who did a show with us a couple of weeks ago about the Australian work, anti-radar, blah, blah, blah. Can we get Parshall and Tully to touch on the flight to nowhere, particularly the US Navy chain of command issues arising from it? So for those who don't know what that is, what is the flight to nowhere? And then you can answer the question, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. The bottom line is that the carrier Hornet, her operations during the Battle of Midway were miserable, and she was completely ineffectual. Her morning strike group goes off in a completely different direction from the majority of the aircraft that are launched by both Yorktown and Enterprise, and they go off on this flight to nowhere where they sight nothing, they attack nothing. Many of those planes end up going into the drink on the way home. There's been a lot of speculation on what was going on there. I think the best account of that is actually in Craig Simon's new book, because he really drills into that. Bottom line, it looks as if Captain Mitcher, he was a captain at the time, didn't like working for Spruance, didn't like working for Fletcher. He was an aviator. Those two guys were not. And he was convinced that there was a second group of Japanese carriers out there that had not been detected. And so he sent his air group off to look for those carriers, and the result was that they found absolutely nothing. It's pretty clear when you start looking at the sort of the scuttlebutt later on, it's clear that Spruance knows that Mitcher's report for Hornet is bogus. And in fact, he explicitly says that if you've got questions between, the veracity of Enterprise's report and Hornet's report, believe Enterprise. So I think what's going on there, the reason they don't want to take a hard look at that is it raises a whole bunch of really sticky issues. The one squadron from Hornet that does attack is VT-8, gets shot down. The only reason that it attacked was because her commander, Waldron, was completely insubordinate. So, Tony, go ahead.
Sorry.
I would like to add to what John said about his description there. In a Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, John Lundstrom goes into the chain of command and personality issues a little bit. And I've also learned some more about Mitcher and research for Philippine Sea. Another way to think about what's going on is it happens kind of described that way. But it seems that Mitcher is one of those people that it's not because he's doing something incompetent, it's because he's too aggressive. He will not listen to anyone's advice. He's one of those people you can't advise. And so he takes it into his head to go due west on this search for the separated group of Japanese carriers that is presumed to be there, like John said, because at the time they thought the two carriers were operating apart rather than together as four. He's so convinced of that. Apparently, you can't prove it yet, but he lays out a good case. On his own, in defiance of anything Spruance wanted, he orders his squadron to go due west, looking for the other two, and they find nothing, just like Don described. But apparently it had to do with Mitcher being too aggressive, too convinced of his own idea. Mm-hmm. That's why his later career it might not seem to match. It's consistent because what he is aggressive.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get back to some of the myths again and the myth busting. So we talked
the 1976 movie captures those perfectly.
Okay, so we talked about Fuchida and his incorrect version of the sequence of events. Then, if I'm understanding it correctly, blend that with the American writing about the battle in the 60s and 70s, because didn't they assume that Japanese carrier operations basically in doctrine basically dovetail with their carrier doctrine, and the two are not anything like similar, and so therefore it kind of doubled down on the errors as opposed to kind of dismissing them. If they had understood Japanese carrier operations, do you think these early authors might have identified some flaws in his accounts earlier?
Yeah, potentially, yes. I mean, the bottom line is, if you're an American author in the 70s, 60s, even 80s, trying to write a book, you've really only got 3 decent Japanese sources to work from. You got Fuchida,
yep.
You've got the Nagumo report, which is the after-action report that Nagumo wrote that was captured on Saipan and translated. And then you've got a series of interviews through the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey that were conducted immediately after the war. Fuchida is one of those guys. Other than that, there's not a lot in English. And so if you've got this beautiful account from Fuchida that seems to dovetail very nicely with, what we think about the battle, why would you ever go, look any further? Particularly if you have to use the Koda Choshos. You've seen them, right? They're god-awful. Why would you want to use that stuff? So
and then we have language and all that. Yeah.
Handwritten Japanese, please. So I think that's a lot of what's going on. It was just easier to use Fuchida and those other sources and not to go looking.
Okay, that makes sense. So Nagumo, so he is kind of the numero uno mistake maker in certain circles. And a couple of the things I'd like you to address is, one, is he hampered by him not getting every bit of information from Yamamoto? That's one of the established narrative. And the second one, and you can tackle these individually or separately, is Scout Plane 4 taking off late. I'm not sure whether we use those, when I say we, authors use those to kind of quantify Nagumo's mistakes, prove that I don't quite know. I suppose different authors have used them for different things, but let's just say, was he blinded somehow in any way by information not getting to him from Yamamoto? And what the Scout Plane 4 saga, explain both of them if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, and actually what I want to do is I want to set my buddy Tony up to talk a little bit about the War College article that he wrote a couple of years ago regarding the Scout Plane operations. Let me address the bit about Yamamoto not giving Nagumo enough information. I don't buy that at all. And we addressed that fairly conclusively in the book, that there was this myth that Yamamoto withheld some of the information that was coming into him from Nagumo, and that Nagumo didn't necessarily know that that Midway was perhaps as alert and as prepared as it turned out to be. It's pretty clear from Nagumo's own pre-battle reports that they had some inklings that they might be up against relatively stiff opposition. What they weren't, though, expecting was any sort of naval opposition. And so that's the real problem, is sort of the few planes that they end up using. They're only using 7 scout planes that morning, and there's a reason for that. Tony, take it away.
As I read this recent article in 2014 or 2015 for Naval War College with Lou Yu that I did with him, explored, basically the Japanese search patterns were determined by how likely they thought it was that they would encounter enemy naval opposition, whether it's carriers or surface ships. The density of the search would be determined by how likely their intelligence going into the battle told them that they would be to encounter enemy ships that day. Long story short, when you compare it to earlier operations, what Nagumo sets up airborne up for search on the morning of June 4th exactly matches other revelations coming from Japan and since, even some posthumous confessions and stuff. Long story short, that they go into battle on June 4th that morning, absolutely convinced they are not going to encounter American carriers. Not on June 4th, maybe June 5 or June 6, rushing to the scene, but not on June 4th. They are absolutely convinced of it. Our side can never understand it if we don't understand that they are absolutely convinced of it, even if they shouldn't have been. That's their assumption, and that drives all their decisions. And it's and so the what ifs that if they miss that, they're already missing that the Japanese are going to that battle absolutely convinced they're not going to sight American carriers that day or have to deal with them. That's why the search is sort of a check the boxes kind of search, it's not a weak search for not expecting anything. And that's what the article showed comparing the things. Now, the various confessions from Japan showed that even as soon as less than an hour after they launched the strike against Midway, order was issued to prepare for a second strike against Midway with land armament to equip the second strike for land unless told otherwise, to get ready for that. So it kind of confirms the fact that they were fully expecting to have to strike Midway a second time. They're not thinking in terms of an American carrier at all. And I'd like to set John up to explain, as far as Tony 4, the delay, some of the myths about that. Also, Chikuma 5's plane, which misses some opportunities. I'll let John take that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of mystery around, why did Tone number 4 get launched late? The answer is we don't know. Something happened on the catapult. No one's ever really figured that out. It turned out that actually it worked to Nagumo's advantage, because after that pilot, a guy named Amari, took off and flew his route, he clearly knew that he was behind schedule, and so he sort of hot-dogged his route and went right up the middle of his vector, probably turned back on his dogleg earlier than he should have, and actually ends up sighting the Americans sooner than he would have if he had actually flown his proper route.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, there's lots of questions coming in about zeros at the moment, which is good. I'm glad I say lots. There's enough to manage with. So, hang on, that's not the one. That's the one. Yeah, we just did that one. What about, did we do that one, John? So the myth that torpedo bombers attack. Yeah. What's your comment on that one?
Yeah, exactly. The common mythos has always been that, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was horrific, but at least what it did is it dragged the Zeros down to water level, and that, opened up the way for the dive bombers to come in and do their thing. The problem with that is that a Zero can climb from 0 to I believe it's 20,000 feet in 7 minutes and 27 seconds, something like that. So you think about the fact that VT8 was totally destroyed by about 0940. VT6 is totally destroyed and driven out of the area by around 10 o'clock in the morning. The dive bomber attack doesn't happen until 10:20. Those Zeros had plenty of opportunity to get back up to altitude if they had needed to do so. Really what ends up happening, I think, is it's VT3, which comes in at the same time that Yorktown's dive bombers do. They're sighted at about 10:10 in the morning by the Japanese coming in from the southeast. And that acts like a magnet, just drags all the Cap Zeros into the southeast threat vector to start going after VT3. And that's really what leaves the way open for the dive bombers. It's really more of a lateral distortion rather than a vertical distortion, if you will.
I think this is the second time
with Torpedo 8 and Torpedo 6, they are, as John just showed with all the Kodo Choshos, they are the cause of having to keep the cycle, the combat air patrol cycles of landing, refueling, and launching again. They cause that. That's what they really do, is they prevent the Japanese from having a chance to bring any planes up to the flight deck of the strikeways.
Yeah. All right. I see our question from KG here. Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, should Nagumo have launched with, anything that was flyable when he could have? Yeah, probably so. If nothing else, it gets those aircraft out of your hangar decks. That's passive damage control. Even if they couldn't have been effective against the carriers, if they're armed with land attack weapons, who cares? Get them out of the hangars. But, again, Nagumo is picking what is the doctrinally correct solution, which is to go in with a combined strike of both torpedo planes and dive bombers. You got to remember, this is real early in the war. We haven't fought any carrier battles before. So if you look at the playbook for how you do this stuff from a doctrinal standpoint, I mean, it's minuscule. We're kind of making up as we go along, and so are the Japanese.
Another factor is that the soonest they would have been able to launch is still a half hour. No, even Yamaguchi's strike planes are not on the flight deck. They would have had to be brought up and spotted, warmed up, and then launched. So 9:10 is probably as soon as they could launch anything.
Right.
Now, this is possibly a Monday morning quarterbacking question here, but when you were showing down the state of the two fleets before Coral Sea, after Coral Sea, before Midway, after Midway, and we now know the sequence of events, what rationale can we give for the Japanese to do Coral Sea? Because we're now seeing it either do one or the other. It doesn't seem to make any sense with the benefit of the hindsight. But what was their rationale for Coral Sea and Midway?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is driven by faulty intelligence that they think they don't know how many carriers the Americans have in the Pacific to start with. They're reasonably convinced, too, that their carriers are better than ours. And so, if we just send a duo down here, that should be sufficient. Why would the Americans have carriers in the South Pacific, really? So, there's a fair amount of misinformation, I think, on the Japanese side that's kind of driving that. But at the end of the day, it is a really boneheaded move because you are mortgaging the future of the more important operation, Midway, on the outcome of Coral Sea, when if you had just, checked your ambition for a couple of months and brought all 6 of your carriers to Midway, it's really tough for the Americans to win that battle under any circumstances.
I mean, that's how I see it. From my, reading your book and my limited knowledge of the Pacific campaign is 6 carriers there at Midway. It doesn't guarantee the Japanese victory, but it really the idea that the Americans were up against a numerically superior force would have absolutely been true had the Japanese had 6 carriers there. But as you said earlier, we can reinforce this idea. When you actually compare the striking components of these 2 forces, there isn't this massive, great Japanese numerical superiority.
Right.
But if they had those 6 carriers, they really are going in there with a substantial force. It's about how well Nimitz plays the tactics. He can't magic extra forces out of thin air. It's
right. Well, okay, so here's a sort of a shocking thing, though. I've just written an article that's been submitted to the Naval War College. I hope they end up picking it up. A lot of people know that Nimitz was willing to give battle at odds of 3 carriers versus 5 if Zuikaku had been able to come along to the party. He was actually willing to fight at odds of 2 carriers against 5 if Yorktown couldn't have been patched up. Wow. But you got to remember that doctrine says that 1 squadron of dive bombers, 15 to 18 planes, should get about 1 hit in 6. 3 hits ought to disable a carrier. So then theoretically, if I'm carrying 2 squadrons of dive bombers on each one of my flight decks, even setting aside the torpedo planes, that means that theoretically my 3 carriers should be able to knock 6 of theirs out in a single attack if everything goes great. Whether or not that's actually going to happen or not, those are still scary odds, I think, but it's not as lopsided as it seems initially.
So, I mean, going back to this lopsided idea, when before you were able to join us earlier because of the problems, this idea that Midway is this, for Americans, this understrength force against numerically superior enemy that is do Americans want that undermined by truth in a sense? And I don't just mean Americans. I mean, isn't it important now that Midway is perceived this way? I'm kind of being devil's advocate. For me, I always want to know the truth and the importance of things, but is there a symbolism about it? And was there indeed, more importantly, in fact, I think you said this in your presentation, the symbolism at the time, how King takes this and uses it, because it's not just what the Navy's approaches, it's how the public feel about this. That's how hard factory workers work. That's where the Battle of Britain, which I bring up because I'm British, you may have noticed, comes into play. It's not just what's happening in the air, it's the people in the factories feeling more inclined to work a bit harder. It's people moving about with a smile on their face post Battle of Britain and a confidence, and confidence is huge. Look at a sports season starting. A team that goes into it confident has an advantage of a team that goes in that's struggling. And so I think that's where, and this is hard to measure, whether you can't go back and look, you ask the public, how did you feel at, mid-June 42 about Midway? But I'd like your thoughts on that, John and Tony, about this need for it to be seen as a certain thing.
I see the miracle at Midway and incredible victory myth. I think that is a post-war manufacturing thing. If you look at the headlines in like the New York Times and that sort of thing, we really didn't have good information on what the Japanese had brought to the party, or really their total force structure that was running around the Pacific at that point in time. I think it really is more ex post facto that we become aware that, okay, yeah, on the morning of 4 June, there were a lot of Japanese warships running around somewhere in the Pacific. But, you know, at the tip of the spear, those two carrier forces were very evenly matched. I do think that the Americans, yeah, of course, everybody loves a story of the plucky underdogs, you know, triumphing against, you know, really grim odds. And it's kind of a bummer, you know, when people like me walk in and point out these uncomfortable facts.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Tony, what do you think about that?
Well, part of it is that the perception of the battle, even though they kind of have some of the nitty-gritty details are wrong, the psychological truth is true. In 5 to 6 minutes, you do knock out 3 first-line Japanese carriers. Yeah. That the planes were down in the hangar rather than the flight deck, that's a forensic detail that's very important to ship enthusiasts and analysts like ourselves. But in the battle sense, no, it still causes it to be fatally hit and sink. So the result's the same. And here he's lone fight against Yorktown. That's the same. Also, the 4 carriers were lost. That was recognized in the middle of war. That was enough to inspire people. And don't forget all the exaggeration of land-based air, John, B-17s. They thought they'd gotten a battleship and stuff. And the Mikuma was mistaken for a battleship too. Even though Nimitz and them knew early because they had a good photograph, no one went out of their way to tell the news people that that's not a battleship that was sunk the 2 days after the carriers were. So you have a lot of that kind of inspiration, and a lot of it was to drive war bonds and stuff.
Yeah, that came up in the conversation.
Like that. Flag About Father is a great description of that psychological aspect of drives back at home, tying the battle claims. But
I mean, another thing I want to bring up, and someone wants you to break down a little bit more in simple terms the differences between carrier doctrine between the Japanese and Americans. I mean, I know simple terms in your case, you could go on for hours about it, but yeah, I will kind of ask you to do that in simple terms. But one of the things that's fascinating me as basically a ground warfare guy is that a battle that on the surface, no pun intended, as large as Midway, there's not that many people in a position to actually see what's going on and see what's going on correctly. You mentioned the B-17s. It came out right at the beginning of the sidebar, how the crews of those B-17s gave all sorts of things about what they got and didn't got that wasn't the case. You've got Ensign Gay in the water there who's seeing things, who's basically the only guy giving the point of view. And I'm not saying whether he's right or wrong, but basing anything on basically one view is a inherently flawed concept. Whereas you take something like D-Day, I know there's a huge naval element, but you've got lots of guys, hundreds, thousands of guys on beaches. You're not going to get fundamental mistakes about enemy forces and timing because you've got a great body of work. So I know you've got your archival stuff, but there really aren't that many people involved in Midway who can actually run you through these events accurately. That's fascinating, given we're talking about the number of carriers and the number of aircraft. But the losses of the aircraft were vast. And then I want you to touch on in a minute on this loss of experienced Japanese crews. So how many Japanese crews were able to tell their story later on? And so how much of an impact does just not having enough accounts play on everybody's understanding of this battle?
I think it has a terribly deleterious impact on this battle.
Lovely word. Extra marks for wonderful use of the word there, John. Yeah.
Son of English.
First use on World War II TV, I think, for that. Well done.
And I would say that extends as well to the photographic record. I mean, this is one of the 4 or 5 biggest battles in American military history. Those B-17 pictures that I showed you are the only ones that we have of the enemy's warships. Yeah. That's crazy. You know, we've got a handful of photographs of the bombing on Midway. But yeah, as you say, there's not a lot of direct eyewitness accounts of what was going on here. And the ones that we did get, in many cases, are skewed and have agendas. So, actually, I'd like to go back and just point out, though, when we started writing the book, we didn't have a clue about Fuchida. Shattered Sword was never about, let's get Fuchida. You know, it was like at least 2 years into the project when suddenly things are like, this doesn't make sense. What's going on here? And it it really was John Lundstrom. He called me at work one afternoon. He's like, John, have you ever really looked at those B-17 photos? There aren't any planes on the flight deck. What does that mean? And it was just one of those, we've all seen those photos a million times, but completely glossed over, there are no aircraft on the flight decks there. So I guess I look at our book not necessarily as a revisionist account, but just sort of, hey, here are some sources that used to be used that have been overlooked. Here are additional pieces of information from some newer Japanese accounts that we've been able to bring in, and as a result, a fairly major reinterpretation.
And well, thank you for that. And again, just so I've completely lost my train of thought now. That happens to me sometimes. Tony, rescue me. Say something. I'll think about what I'm going to say in a minute.
To add what John said, we didn't even go into this planning on. The way it started was when Nauticus contacted us to identify some wreckage they found off Midway that turned out to be the Japanese Karakaga. We were able to tell them that February 2000. That inspired the idea that the battle might need a new story, a new telling. And like John said, we didn't go into this expecting. What we did is as we started to use Fujita's account, we started finding it didn't match what we were gathering, that no one had asked these questions. Like John Lundstrom noticing the flight decks had been empty. That had been clear in pictures forever. What we didn't know, since we weren't familiar, at least I wasn't, with flight deck operations to that detail, I didn't realize them being empty mattered, because hell, they're bombed at 10:20 at full, 2 hours later? So I never thought that mattered. But it turns out to be the clue that if they were empty then, and Fujita said they were on the flight deck, that's already categorically wrong. Same thing tipped us off that he'd done the same thing at 10:20. And so that's how that got going.
Yeah. I remember what I was going to say now, and that was about just giving us this breakdown of, in a few sentences, American carrier doctrine, Japanese carrier doctrine. There must have clearly been some big differences. What were they?
Yeah, I think you can say in a nutshell, the Japanese were hyper offensive, whereas the Americans were certainly very aware of the defensive nature of the battle being important, and that leads to our unwillingness to actually mass our carriers into one big task force. We're going to split them apart because we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. Yeah. That means that for the Japanese, they are much better at coordinating offensive power than we are. So you witness their morning attack where they put up, a strike force of 108 aircraft from 4 separate flight decks, get them completely marshaled up and off to their target within about 10 minutes. There's no way that the Americans could do that kind of stuff. But, the price that the Japanese pay for it, of course, is, again, putting all their eggs in one basket. They had done a lot of work, too, on just sort of the nuts and bolts of, okay, how do we get those forces off of the flight deck and merge together cleanly, and had come up with this notion of a deck load strike where you would just use one squadron of your 2 squadrons on your, either your torpedo planes or your dive bombers, package of fighters, fits on the flight deck pretty cleanly. All 4 carriers can get that off pretty quickly and up and away they go. The Americans didn't have any sort of standardized doctrine around what their strike packages looked like, and that's part of why our air operations later in the morning were bollocksed. So.
Not another nice use of word. Yeah, I mean, and this, I mean, I'm reminded because we've had both movies, most articles about Midway, because I do my prep for this. I just search Midway and read. I want to get an idea of how it's presented by other people, because I know how you're going to present it. So I kind of try and get that idea of what's still being told about it. And it always starts with Pearl Harbor, and then you get Midway. And it reminds me, and Pearl Harbor was, as you say there, the Japanese didn't have to do any kind of defensive capability. It was all offense, and they were good at that. I'm minding when I was a sort of a young lad, my granddad was talking to me about, if you get in a fight with someone, lad, make sure you hit first once, hit really hard, and make sure that person goes down. And I said to my granddad, but what happens if he stands up again? He said, you're fucked, he said, and that's that. And I kind of think that a little bit analogy there, that if you're putting your eggs into one basket of an amazing first strike, you've got to make sure that works. Because if you don't, your fallback plan is and it seems that I'm very, very simplifying the Midway by that, and you're thinking, oh God, he's so oversimplifying it. But that it does make sense to me that first strike just wasn't big enough.
Yeah, well, but that was really all that they could have mounted immediately. Yeah. And the other thing, too, the Japanese, I don't think really had any sense for just how weak their defensive arrangements were. I mean, if you look at it, up until 10-20, their combat air patrol is doing great. They shoot down, everything that comes at them. And from their standpoint, they're looking at these, a lot of rookie American pilots, and they're like, these guys are lousy. We can take them on. What ends up happening at 10-20 is that they've been dealing through the morning with single altitude, single vector attacks coming in. And now at 10-20, they are presented with a multi-altitude, multi-vector attack. They don't have radar. It's over.
Which I think, therefore, thank you for that, is a great time to mention this idea of just how many or how few of the experienced Japanese air crews were lost in that battle, because some things suggest that's it. They've lost all their veteran guys, which therefore suggests that there's no learning curve from this. But again, one of the things you talk about in your book is there are a lot of experienced air crews who do survive this. And so if that's true, what lessons can they take forward? Okay, they have just lost 4 carriers, which is not a good day at the office, but they can at least, they've had an experience of the defensive side of things. So you would like to think that there must be something they can pull out of that and say, okay, we mustn't do this again. So do we see them adapting to this, responding to this? You talked about those operations. I know they're not as enormous, but the Solomons and the New Guinea, is there any signs you can see in how they deploy themselves there to go, lessons learned from Midway?
Yeah, and I want to throw this to Tony for Phil C, because there's a lot of stuff that the Japanese, as Tony explained it to me once, the battle plan for Philippine Sea is do the stuff that worked correctly in the early war stuff and don't do the things that you screwed up at Midway with. There were some earlier developments, in some of the Solomons battles. They would do things like put a light carrier in there whose only job really is to run combat air patrol in conjunction with some of their larger flight decks. But at this point in time, they're kind of behind the 8 ball. They're going to be playing catch up for the remainder of the war. But I'll let Tony talk about Phil C a little bit in terms of how their doctrine evolves.
Okay, what John's referring after Midway, it also is practiced in Guadalcanal, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz. But by the time Philippine Sea, the Japanese are set upon one thing they do is to keep a strike wave on the flight deck ready to go. And you see the same thing at Santa Cruz. And that was even under Nagumo's under Santa Cruz. So they've learned that lesson. Keep the strike wave on deck ready to go and have their search planes out early and in large numbers. And the moment the enemy fleet is detected, send off the strike. That way you keep the flight deck out of danger and the hangar's not filled with a bunch of armed and fueled aircraft either. That's one of the things they're doing at Philippine Sea very deliberately and intentionally. And the other is the extensive long-range searches that they're doing. The other element they're doing is the carriers are operating further apart with a combat air patrol specific to each one. The other innovation they do, and it's more inspired by the experience at Midway of what happened when it's more inspired by Carl C than Midway. What happens when you go after the wrong target? The Japanese at Santa Cruz have this idea of pushing out a large number of surface ships in what they call Vanguard that is in front of the carrier force. The whole point is to be an ACAC trap, an anti-aircraft trap for incoming squadrons on their way to attack the carriers, an obstacle for them to get by, and also maybe with any luck draw attacks, because American planes did have a habit to go after big battleships. Yeah. They could operate almost as honeypots if you use them right, and the Japanese knew that. They use that at Philippine Sea extensively too. So those are about the 3 main things they use, and the other is damage control improvements. They weren't as successful in that, but partly because of complex circumstances. The new foam equipment they install is fairly effective. They're able to use it later at Lake Gulf that way. But I wanted to add one little detail to what John said about the doctrine, because we covered in our book, and it's very interesting. The Japanese had also worked out pre-war a way to land planes without a landing signal officer by using a light array that was very ingenious, that we liked so much, we introduced elements of it in the Korean War.
So that's some of the improvements the Japanese made. You know what question's coming next. What improvements did the Americans make? Now, I know to kind of add a bit of information, you tend to look at improvements more if you've had a bad day at the office than if you had a good day at the office. And of course, from the American point of view, it has been very much a good day at the office, but there's been some serious loss of some aircraft. There's been some damage control issues on the Yorktown, whatever. So that they, out of this victory, there must still be some yes, but we can make some improvements. So what are their key ones?
That's a good question, actually. I do think that our deck operations became more streamlined as a result of that. Part of the problem in the early morning strikes from Hornet and Enterprise is that they tried to basically put every plane in the air that they could, and that meant that they had to break that strike in half and actually respot aircraft and so forth. We don't do that as much after Midway because it's clear that time is of the essence. You need to get those planes up in the air. Actually, in terms of damage control, I think it was a very good day at the office. Yorktown demonstrated that class of ship was extremely damage resistant. This whole business of draining the fuel lines and filling them full of CO2 so that they couldn't catch on fire, that was an innovation that actually had been introduced between Coral Sea and Midway. So, within a month's time that we had figured that out. I see a comment here around more AA. Now let's fast forward to 1944. If you look at the battles in 1942, there are going to be a couple more carrier battles. 1943 is halftime. There are no carrier battles because both sides' carrier forces are beaten up. 1944, we come back out of the locker room after halftime with essentially a completely new Navy. We're flying brand new fighters in the Hellcat, which is far superior to the Zero. Those pilots are much better trained at that point in time. We have festooned our warships now with 20 millimeter, 40 millimeter, and we've got a lot of 5-inch AA that is all using VT fused ammunition at this point, which increases its lethality by a factor of 5 to 7. Damage control is improved. All of those AA systems now are radar coordinated, and all of the fighters are likewise being centrally coordinated in a combat information center. So in terms of not only quantitative improvements, but qualitative improvements, it's just night and day. The lethality of U.S. carrier forces by the time you get to mid-1944 is just eye-watering. Getting anywhere near one of those forces is tantamount to committing suicide.
I mean, that's broad. Thank you. That's broadly the case for everything in 44. The Russian army, the British army, the British Royal Air Force, everything has improved in leaps and bounds. And the Germans and the Japanese, because they are now on the back foot, have been improving things a little bit. But their arc of improvement has slowed down considerably post. I'm not going to put a date on it. Late 42, early 42, whatever you want to call it. And so the balance of power has shifted. By 44, operations in Pacific, operations in the ETO, operations in the Eastern Front have this element of this can't really go wrong unless we really, really, really screw up because we have so much of everything. As James Holland, for example, talks about that restrictions of wealth we have. And actually more difficult for us now is getting all our shit into the place to get a battle because it takes a long time to bring our huge supply lines in, be it Navy, be it air power, be it land-based. But 42, as I've been saying a lot recently on World War II TV, is this pivotal year where things are on a knife edge. And we know that all these battles went this way, or this way. So many of them could have gone another way. And so going it back to the fact about your book, Shattered Sword, 2006 it came out. So Frank McDonough, who wrote a 2-volume history about the Third Reich and the German army, when he did an interview with me, I think in November, he said, I fully expect that my book on the Third Reich will be out of date, certainly within 10 years, but probably out of date within 5 years. And that's as expected, he said. So where are we? And I was going to ask you now about did you get much pushback? You got some support from some historians. We are not quite, we're 15 years on from it coming out. I know you have your active websites, you both write articles, you're continuing to write, but what stage are we now in? Are we in people coming back and agreeing with what you're saying? Has the pushback ended? Is there more documentation? Is there more support? Where are we roughly?
We were actually very fortunate in that regard. I will say that when you're going into trying to revise 60 years worth of the conventional wisdom on a battle that's this important, you got to kind of come armed for bear. And, there are 1,381 endnotes in this stupid book. And it's because everything, you got to document what you're coming with. And honestly, the reception within the naval historical community was extremely favorable. I think the primary revisions that we set out on the table have been accepted. There are, a couple of outliers there that don't like us going after Fuchida because he, was a man of the cloth, et cetera, et cetera. But by and large, now, that said, are there things that we have learned from now in the last 15 years? And yeah, are there things that I would rewrite if I had to do it a second time? You bet. Some of the details around the submarine Tambor's encounter with Cruiser Division 7, I think, should be completely rewritten. There's one vignette where a B-26 from the island of Midway appears to be crash diving on the Akagi. I think that's a Fuchida-ism. I think actually that was Jim Murray's plane that was skimming the flight deck, and Jim Murray actually survived that attack and made it home to Midway. So, there are some details here and there, but by and large, the book has stood up very well. Tony, do you have any?
Well, the most obvious would be what mentioned earlier, that article on the Japanese search. We would build that into a new edition. What the new insights from that. We've actually learned more that confirms that thesis about the state of the flight decks at 1020. If anything, it's even more certain that there were no strike aircraft on flight deck. Maybe one K, you can't get that nitpicky, but there was no strike waves spotting, let alone ready to take off at 1020 on any of the four carriers. Even Hiryu is very late because according to conventional vision, their carrier plane should be taking off as the other three are being bombed, if that had been true. That's not the case. And we now know that Kaga takes one of its torpedo planes, lands it at 10.5. Remember, John explained how Akagi had landed three fighters at 10.10. Kaga's recovering a Kate torpedo plane at 10.5. That's Yoshino Harua's recon torpedo plane. There's nothing on her flight deck. So we would build all that into a new edition.
So there's some refinement, but nothing that's going to absolutely change it. But what's interesting, because we are coming up for 2 hours now, which is great. But I've noticed the questions in the comments are now going into other things, the Marianas turkey shoot. And I think that's where I kind of want to end it. For me, it's not that the Battle of Midway needs necessarily re-examining. It's the fact that there's more contextual stuff needs to happen. We need to look at the next stages, and it's that idea of examining it as a solo event needs to broaden. And we were talking about that when I had a chat with John yesterday pre this show, is that there needs to be more books, generally more work that connects the dots, connects Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and a book on Midway can be really good. But if it just begins kind of May, ends June the 5th, how much can we really learn from Midway if we don't take those lessons forward, if we don't look at the thing? But then, of course, you end up with that spider's web thing where you disappear down rabbit holes, as I often do on this channel, as Drac does on his channel, as Jamie Armored Carriers does on his channel, where you suddenly go off and talk about something else and you lose focus. But I think would you agree that there's more need to put Midway in that contextual understanding of the Pacific as an entire conflict?
Short answer, yeah, for sure. Again, it feels sort of weird to have written a book on Midway and yet not be sort of holding up Midway as the greatest battle in the history of mankind. That should sell more books, right? But that's really never been Tony and my attitude towards it. That Midway's importance again is within the larger context
Yeah.
of 1942 and the conditions that it creates for the counteroffensive down in the Solomons. That campaign is crucial to breaking the Japanese Navy's back, as Tony mentioned. So, yeah, Midway has to be seen as a component to the whole year's campaign.
But as you say, that's not a good subtitle for a book or a documentary or a film. If you say the battle that turned the tide in the war, that, however many words that was, 8 words, says something that everybody can understand and respond to emotionally immediately. Having a 30-sentence, because it led to this, and torpedo design improved here, and they looked at the flight decks, and we took that, you've lost people after the second sentence. And I think that's what people like myself and Drac are trying to do, whereas you do go that extra mile and try and put a bit more context and a bit more post-event analysis as just the event itself, really.
Yeah,
there's more that can be done on the American side even. If you look at a glorious page in our history, that's the most comprehensive overall thing of the American flight operations at Battle of Midway, from the American side down to, the squadron levels and all that. There's a lot of room to actually re-examine some of that. Get down to the nitty-gritty of the flight to nowhere, learn more about that. Some of the different deck operations between Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. A Black Shoe Carrier Admiral goes into that a bit, but there's a lot. The American side still can stand some attention.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And then, there's all sorts of books, people mentioning Tower of Skulls, all these other things there, and all that micro analysis is all important. Yeah. And I do stuff on my channel, and people like Bruce Gamble doing his stuff about Rabaul and Carl James. But the thing is, the more you go for, and the more you say we're looking at half an hour in one battle on one campaign, you're narrowing your audience for that book, because people want to have that single volume on the Pacific, the single volume on the war, even there. And those books, the more you cram in, the bigger the market, in a sense, for the average reader. So again, I think we've got, that's why movies, things like that, we haven't done much about more movies. We won't talk about the movies as we bring things to an end, but that's where movies bring people in. And then you would like to think they go in for the deeper dive and they read the books. And it's as we all know, who spend most of our time on Amazon, one book leads to 3 more books, which leads to 3 more in each of those books. You go, oh my God, I'm never going to have enough space. I got 2 more books in the post this morning, and it's like, oh, now I've got to have to redesign the whole shelves again, because to put them in where they should go, I have to move that one over there, put that one over there. That's a morning spent now just buggering about with books. Anyway, any closing comments from you two about how my viewers aren't the deep dive Navy people, they're overview World War II people? Any kind of single comment to throw into people's minds to take away as the thing they should think about when they're considering Midway?
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll plug here and say, if you're interested in overviews, my current book project is a new history of the year 1942. So looking at not only Pacific, but Mediterranean, Eastern Front, Battle of the Atlantic, the whole thing, because I too am very interested in the connections between these battles and the connection between the various theaters. So that's
brilliant. And Tony, what kind of give my viewers a takeaway to kind of go away and go, oh, what's your Midway soundbite?
Well, among the general population, since it's a question that comes up a lot, just to address it real quick, the 2 movies on Midway, the 1976 movie, if you'll just imagine all those planes crammed down in the hangar and the flight deck clear, it does a decent job of conveying what happened. Okay, it does a good job of the Japanese staff work. It's actually kind of good. And the way it shows the relation of the Doolittle raid in psychologically motivating the Battle of Midway on Yamamoto's part is authentic. Now, the newer movie does a great job of showing how the secret order to Halsey to be deliberately spotted and then run back. That's part of the reason Nagumo is not expecting them. They had last sighted our 2 carriers down southwest. The new movie shows that accurately, even if it's not even close to authentic on how the pilots were, their personalities. But that's just something to notice. The account of the hearing is accurate, and so is Kaga.
Someone needs to do a fan mashup of the best of the 2 movies with a little bit of John's PowerPoint presentation and have that 3 hours there. And that becomes the new way forward. Because, I particularly about the new movie, I did like that exhilaration of the dive bombers going in. You don't get any of that in the use of the original footage in the 76 movie. That, I didn't like the Dick Best character, but I did like that sequence, although it was over very quickly. was thrilling.
Yeah.
And combining that with some of the kind of 1976 exposition that I think was better, and we moved Charlton Heston's line where he says, "Well, I guess there was." He says, "I damn well think you do, Tiger." When he's that line needs to, in fact, basically Charlton Heston needs to just go. Really, I think, pretty much.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, well, it's been absolutely marvelous talking to you two guys, and you are more than welcome to come back on and either expand on Midway or talk about some of your other research in the Pacific, because the more we go into the Pacific, and I think because I started this and it was directed at my friends, a lot of my friends, ETO guys, they are and girls are now coming with me on this Pacific adventure that we're taking. I think we're all finding it really fascinating. So if you want to come back and do a deeper dive, you'd be more than welcome to do that.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. I will just remind people what we've got coming up this week. I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, tomorrow night, Bill McDonald, Canadian historian, coming talking about William Stevenson, the intrepid, the spy master, myth and reality. We'll be looking at that story tomorrow. Nothing on Wednesday yet because I've had to do two shows on Thursday. We're doing a look. Second show is with Chris Millington about the French occupation. The first show is I forgot what the first show is. Homosexuals in World War II serving with the British Army. That'd be fantastic. And then Friday, my God, we've got Adam Tooze coming on about the economy in the Third Reich and its collapse and the collapse of the Third Reich. That would be amazing. So stick with me as usual. Check out the links below. The links to John and Tony's website is there below. The link to buy the book is there below. Check out some of the interviews with John on Draken Iffel's channel as well. There's some more stuff on Midway there. That's all worth going into. And as usual, spread the word on social media. It's been good viewing numbers earlier tonight, so that's really good. But now it remains me to say thank you to Tony and John for joining us. Did you gentlemen enjoy it?
Absolutely.
Yes, very much.
Always.
Well, brilliant. Well, thank you very much. And I'm glad we got over that internet hiccup and whatever it was. Did the hamster die in the wheel? Was he like a new hamster to turn the wheel? Well,
I don't know. So when I was doing the presentation, I was, I'm reading from Fuchida and I'm looking over on my Windows machine and hitting refresh to make sure that I'm still live.
Yeah. You're not just talking to yourself. Yeah, no, I've been there. Well, anyway, thank you very much, guys. As always, say thank you everybody for watching, and it's been an amazing show. So I will see you all again tomorrow. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for watching.
Take care.
Thank you.